Okay, good afternoon. I hope that you're all well and safe and healthy during this difficult and rather strange time. Because our lectures have been cancelled and because the university has been closed for the time being, I've wanted to start uploading short commentaries instead of our lecture sessions. Short commentaries which will simply explain some of the key topics and some of the key themes that we would have covered in the lectures had they been going ahead. So starting this week, I'll be uploading these commentaries alongside the lecture slideshows, which will all be up on Moodle, and you'll be able to follow those, I hope, relatively easily. If you have any additional questions or any thoughts about anything, of course, you can contact me on those. The readings are also up on Moodle, the two course books that we're looking at, that we're working from, and links also to the documentary, the Death of Yugoslavia. So all of the information that you should need to write your essays and write your assignments, and keep up with the course on a week-by-week basis should be available. Now, I don't know what's going to happen later on with the exam. But as soon as the university has decided what's going to happen and what the contingencies are, I'll contact you all via Moodle, and we can discuss, if needs be, alternatives to taking the exam. Okay, so what I wanted to do then in this session, week I think number 5, is pick up very briefly where we left off from last week, or at least before we broke up, before we cancelled, before the university was closed. We talked about Kosovo. We talked about some of the ethnic tensions between the majority Albanian population and the minority Serbian population. And we talked about how those tensions have been ongoing and had been particularly acute after the Second World War. And I had also told you that, particularly for the Serbian population, there was a sense that group was sort of diminishing, that the Albanian population was enlarging, and this was becoming an issue of, just considerable anxiety for many people, many of the Serbs who lived in Kosovo. Now, added to all of this, of course, there was the problem of economic issues, and I'd mentioned that of all of the parts of Yugoslavia, Kosovo was the poorest, was the most deprived. Its economic development, all of its kind of GDP and all of its economic indices were by all accounts much lower than the rest of the country. So it was very much a powder keg, or if not a powder keg, then at least it was potentially a trouble spot, potentially a problem for the leaders of Yugoslavia, the communist leaders. And many observers, after the death of Tito in 1980, believed that if there were to be trouble, if there was to be a problem in Yugoslavia, it would most likely occur in this part of the country, in Kosovo. And it was precisely because of those reasons, because the economy was so low, was so bad, and also because of these potential ethnic tensions, these ethnic problems between the majority Albanian population and the minority Serb population. I think the last thing we talked about was this very explosive moment in 1986, when excerpts of a memorandum that had been drafted by the Serbian Academy of Arts and Sciences was leaked to a Belgrade daily newspaper. And the language that was being used in the excerpts of this memorandum was extremely explosive. Potentially very inflammatory. The excerpts were talking about how throughout Yugoslavia, the Serbian minorities, the Serbian population, was in as worse a position as it had ever been in its history, or at least not since the Second World War, and then the genocide that had been inflicted on the Serbians at that time. Had there ever been such a grievous and such a dire predicament for the Serbs within Yugoslavia? And Kosovo was mentioned in these excerpts as well, and the memorandum, the authors the people who had drafted the memorandum, used very emotive and very inflammatory language, talking about a process of genocide that they claimed was taking place and was being directed against the Serbian minority. And when they said genocide, essentially what they meant was this kind of squeezing out this diminishing population, this kind of exodus of Serbs from Kosovo. So in the mid-1980s, with Tito out of the picture, the first sort of issue, the first problem, the most explosive problem seemed to be Kosovo. And this memorandum made public many of the sort of, the supposed grievances of the Serbian population. And this was a very kind of inflammatory moment. And you must remember, and if you look back to the slides from our last session, the session before this one, you'll remember that I showed you a map of Yugoslavia, an ethnic map of Yugoslavia, and I showed you that the Serbian population was in the first place the largest population, but it was also the most distributed. There were Serbs living in Serbs living in Serbia, but there were also Serbs living in Kosovo. There were Serb minorities living in the Bosnian Republic, and also a very large number living in the Croatian Republic. So it was potentially a very difficult issue. The prospect of the Serbs uniting or mobilizing behind a nationalist call could potentially really set off the balance, this very delicate balance between all of the ethnicities within Yugoslavia. So this was potentially, the raising of the Serb question was potentially one that could really destabilize Yugoslavia. Now, if we come back to Kosovo momentarily, when these problems were emerging, and particularly after the drafting of the memorandum, the Yugoslav communist leadership and the Serbian party leadership, the Serbian party bosses, extremely concerned about what was happening and seeing the relations between the Albanian majority and the Serbian minority were a very delicate matter, wanted to try to show that they were addressing this problem, that they were aware of this problem, and they were willing, they were listening to all sides, and they wanted to sort of show that Kosovo, despite its economic problems, despite its increasing ethnic problems, this was not a forgotten part of Yugoslavia, that the higher echelons, the very highest levels of the Communist Party in Yugoslavia were listening to the people down there. They were concerned about them, and they were willing to sort of hear their grievances. So the party leadership decided that they would send down a functionary. They would send down somebody from Belgrade, from the Yugoslav capital, a high-ranking communist, and the job of this person would be to go into Kosovo and kind of participate in a series of very well-staged, public appearances, town hall meetings, meeting with local communists, meeting with local people down there, visiting factories. And in doing so, what the Communist Party hoped, the Communist Party in Belgrade, hoped is that this would show people in Kosovo, as I say, that they weren't being ignored, that their grievances were being listened to, that they were sending down very important people, and that they were going to do something about the problems that were emerging, that existed within Kosovo. But in addition to this, of course, they wanted to make sure that both sides, or all sides, of the ethnic divide in Kosovo were acknowledged, and were greeted and were met. So it was not just that they wanted to send down somebody very important and somebody very prominent within the party, but that person would also have to sort of acknowledge this balance between the various ethnic groups within Kosovo, and would have to sort of show that both the Albanians and both the Serbs were being listened to, and that some middle ground could perhaps be found between these two groups. Now, the choice of person that they sent down turned out to be a huge disaster, but nobody could have guessed it at the time. Now, if we look at slide number 1, you'll see a picture of a man called Slobodan Milosevic. Now, Milosevic in the mid-1980s was a high-ranking functionary of the Serbian Communist Party. He had risen up. He had first of all been a banker. He had worked in the Yugoslav economy. when he was younger. He had spent a little bit of time in the United States of America. He had worked for about a year in Chicago, and as a result of this, he spoke very good English. And he had joined the party, and he'd risen up, to quite high level within the party. There's two or three things that are very important to note about Milosevic, because Milosevic would go on to be one of the central figures and the person who many people believed is most directly responsible for the breakup of the country and the violent nature in which the country broke up, the wars of the 1990s. So Milosevic is an extremely important figure. And if you read the books that I've put up online, and if you watch the documentary, there's a lot of interviews with Milosevic, there's a lot of contact with him, and you get a real feel of his sort of political mindset and his ideas and this kind of thing. So this documentary is very good to watch for this. Now, the couple of things. If we move on to slide 2. In this picture, you can see what I would say are the two most important relationships that Milosevic had: a personal one and a political one, personal political and political relationship. In the first picture, in the first slide, the first image in this slide number 2, the numbers are at the bottom right-hand corner of the slides, by the way. Now, in the first image, we can see Milosevic standing alongside his wife, Mira Markovic. Now, Mira and Milosevic had met at a very young age. I think they'd met as childhood sweethearts. And throughout their political career, throughout Milosevic's political career, throughout his life, he was almost completely inseparable from Mira. Very often, when Western diplomats would meet with Milosevic during the 1990s, one of the first things is that they would comment on this very close relationship that Mira Markovic and Slobodan Milosevic had. They would confide with one another. They would very often just speak in baby talk to one another. So they're extremely close personally, but also politically. Now, Mira Markovic was also a rather prominent political figure. She had her own party, which was allied to Milosevic's party later on in the 90s. She came from a political family, and she was very much like Slobodan himself, a political animal. So Mira and Slobodan were very much a power couple within Yugoslavia. And in order to understand Slobodan Milosevic's actions and the way he operates, one must also need to understand that his relationship with his wife was a very close one. Now, the second picture is a picture of Milosevic with his political mentor, a man named Ivan Stambolic, who was a party boss, a communist party boss in Belgrade, and who kind of nurtured and tutored Slobodan Milosevic as he was rising up through the ranks of the Yugoslav Communist Party. Now, Ivan Stambolic and Slobodan Milosevic had been very close, and indeed it was Ivan Stambolic's decision to send Slobodan Milosevic down to Kosovo in the middle of the 1980s, precisely on this assignment of listening to both sides, of listening to the Serbs, listening to the Albanians, and trying to forge a sort of middle ground. Now, at the time, this was not an unreasonable decision for Ivan Stambolic to make. Up until this point, Slobodan Milosevic had always been a very loyal party functionary. He was not tainted. He was a Serbian, of course, Milosevic, but he had not been tainted by any signs of nationalism. He had always shown himself to be a very loyal party worker, loyal to Ivan Stambolic, loyal to the people above him, loyal to Yugoslavia. And for this reason, it was believed that he was the right man to send down to Kosovo. He was sufficiently high enough in the party machinery, in the party bureaucracy, but he was also seen to be a very loyal and a very reliable figure. Now, this from Ivan Stambolic was a disastrous mistake, but he could not have known that at the time. It's the beginning of a transformation that Milosevic undergoes from this very sort of straight shooting, middle of the line, almost boring party bureaucrat into somebody who realizes that Serbian nationalism and the whole Kosovo issue could be something which propels his own political career. And this trip down to Kosovo was indeed a turning point, a transformation for Milosevic. It's almost that when he goes down to Kosovo, he's one person, he's this loyal communist functionary, and when he comes back, he's transformed into something like a nationalist demagogue, somebody who will betray Ivan Stambolic, somebody who will betray, in a sense, the ideals of Tito's Yugoslavia. Now, it happened in the following way. If we move on to slide number 3, you can see a couple of images that were taken from Milosevic's trip to Kosovo in 1987. The whole thing, of course, was filmed and it was shown on the television news that evening. In fact, that was very typical of the Yugoslav communist regime, typical of all communist regimes. They would publicize and broadcast their events and their achievements and the kind of things that they were working on. Now, Milosevic went down to Kosovo, and he, the planned schedule was for Milosevic to go into a town hall meeting, very choreographed, very carefully stage managed, meet a group of party functionaries, Albanian party functionaries, and simply be filmed listening to what they had to say, listening to the sort of the position, the status, the things that were happening in Kosovo, and essentially that would be the end of the story. But whilst Milosevic was in this town hall meeting, meeting with the Albanian party functionaries, a group of Kosovo Serb protesters began to gather outside of the town hall meeting. And Milosevic broke with protocol, broke with the original plan, broke with the stage managed schedule of the event, left the town hall meeting, and began to sort of meet with these protesters and listen to them. And of course, these Kosovo Serb protesters who had been sort of bussed in from across the province, from across Kosovo, began to tell Milosevic about their grievances, about their complaints. And it was very much in tune, it was very much in line with the kind of things that were mentioned in the memorandum. They were complaining that they were being frozen out of jobs, that they were being persecuted by the police down there, that it was very difficult for Serbs living in Kosovo to sort of move up through society, that opportunities were closed off to them and were only open to Albanians, and to all extents they were being treated as second-class citizens, as second-class people within this province. Now, Milosevic listened to them, and again, all of this is filmed on television. In fact, he came back the next day, invited them back, and said he would carry on listening and would go on listening to the kinds of things that they were complaining about. Now, all of this, of course, was filmed, and there's a very famous moment, one which would become one of the defining moments within the crisis and the breakup of Yugoslavia. And if you watch the first episode of the BBC documentary, The Death of Yugoslavia, you can see, this moment which was filmed and which was, as I say, broadcast across Yugoslavia very soon after it happened. As Milosevic was speaking to these Kosovo Serb protesters, the police, the Albanian police, predominantly Albanian police, were pushing protesters back, trying to keep control of them. And one of the protesters cried out to Milosevic, saying, "Milosevic, they're beating us, what will you do about this?" And Milosevic immediately answered back. Milosevic immediately responded, called out to the protesters, and said the line which I've put up at the top of this slide: "Nobody should dare to beat you." Now, this phrase, "nobody should dare to beat you," became a great slogan and a great carrion call for the beginning of what would become the nationalist awakening amongst Serbs within Kosovo. And Milosevic was very much the figurehead and the spearhead of this awakening. The trip to Kosovo had transformed the Milosevic's political outlook. When he returned to Belgrade, he realized the potency, the power, the appeal of potentially unifying Serbs behind this kind of slogan and behind this sense of grievance that they were being treated badly in Kosovo, in Croatia, in Bosnia. For Milosevic, it was almost as if the Serbs were just looking for a champion. They were looking for somebody like him who could speak to their grievances, who could claim to be their champion, claim to be supporting them. And if he did this, of course, he would rise to become a very powerful figure, not just within Serbia, but throughout Yugoslavia. Now, there have been recently, with everything that's happening in the world, and particularly with the sort of rise of nationalist populist groups across Europe and in places like Brazil and the United States of America and in Central Europe, there have been commentators who have compared Milosevic's strategies and Milosevic's tactics to the ones that are being deployed by those right-wing populist leaders in the 21st century. And what this means is, what this comparison is based on is kind of the notion that Milosevic perhaps quite cynically realized that if he could start speaking this language of grievance, if he could sort of acknowledge, okay, I see you Serbs are being persecuted, that you're having a hard time within Yugoslavia, but I'm the person who can fix this. If you get behind me, if you rally behind me, I'll make sure that nobody beats you. I'll make sure that you're not frozen out of these jobs. I'll make sure that these horrible policies that are being implemented in other parts of the country are not any longer implemented. Now, I say cynically because a lot of people believed that Milosevic did not sincerely consider these grievances to be real. He didn't care about them. He simply saw this as a power play. He realized that if he could unify the Serbs within Yugoslavia, if he could become their champion, then he would become the most powerful figure in Yugoslavia. Now, it's precisely what happens, and it happens in a very quick manner. From 1987 onwards, up until sort of 1989, 1990, the last years of Yugoslavia, Milosevic transforms himself from this kind of party functionary to a full-blown nationalist demagogue, a person who is riding this rising tide of Serbian nationalism. Now, if we look at picture slide number 4, this is an image of Milosevic returning to Kosovo in 1989 and giving a huge rally attended by supposedly 1 million people, all of them, of course, Serbian, coming from across the country, not just Kosovo, but Serbia itself, Bosnia, and Croatia. And Milosevic is once again claiming to speak on their behalf, claiming to be their champion, claiming to be somebody who is going to look out for their interests, which are being stamped upon, he says, in Yugoslavia. Now, this takes place in 1989, and that's a very important date. If you remember back to our last session, the last lecture that I gave, I mentioned that Kosovo was a place of almost mystical significance for many Serbs. In 1389, the great battle between the Ottoman Empire and the Serb medieval kingdom had taken place, and legend had it that although the Serbs lost that day, the leader of the Serbs, Lazar, was supposedly visited by Saint Elijah on the eve of the battle, and Saint Elijah sort of made this deal with Lazar that although he would lose the battle the next day, the Serbs would gain a heavenly kingdom. They would gain this eternal kingdom, and one day they would return to Kosovo. So Kosovo was always, not just another part of Serbia. It was a part of Serbia that had a huge importance for many Serbs. And Milosevic kind of understood this, And this speech that he gave in 1989 in Kosovo was steeped in this kind of symbolism. It wasn't just the date itself. Of course, 600 years after, 600 years, the same year, the 600th anniversary of the original battle. It was also the kind of language that Milosevic was using. It was very different from the normal kind of bureaucratic jargon with which Yugoslav communists and Yugoslav communist leaders spoke. It was steeped in this kind of mystical, folkloric references, talking about Tsar Lazar, talking about the Battle of Kosovo, telling the people who had been gathered there that although the battles might be coming again in the future, although they were not presently armed, they could not be ruled out. So it's really a kind of, it's the beginning of a transformation, a new kind of politics. Now, this was horrifying to many people within Kosovo, many people throughout Yugoslavia. If you remember when I told you about what would happen, what was supposed to happen when Tito died in 1980, all of the Yugoslav communist leadership were united in their belief that no new Tito should emerge. That Tito was a one-off, that his prestige, that his position within the Yugoslav setup could not be duplicated, should not be duplicated, and there should be no new strongman coming through. Now, they feared that if a new Tito did come through, he would not be like the old one. He would not be a bona fide Yugoslav. He would be somebody, who was sort of nationally inclined or associated with one of the national republics. This is precisely what happened, of course, with Milosevic. He was not a figure who was loved by the non-Serbs within Yugoslavia. He was, in fact, a figure who was first and foremost popular with Serbs, but threatened to sort of upset the balance. Now, if we move to number 5, the book, The Death of Yugoslavia, explains this in much more detail. So I won't go into this because it's quite a complicated process. But essentially from 1987 until 1989, Milosevic is moving around Yugoslavia, holding these kind of rallies, the kind of political rallies that we see a lot of today in places like the United States and in other parts of the West and other parts of Europe. He called them meetings and meetings for truth. He would meet with very large crowds of people, Milosevic would, and he would speak ill against the Yugoslav system. He would talk about how it was too slow, how it was steeped in bureaucracy, how it needed to be transformed, how some sort of what he called an anti-bureaucratic revolution needed to take place. Now, Milosevic was, of course, again, very cynically using the apparatus of the Yugoslav state for his own purpose. He was trying to consolidate a power base and a base of popular support as well, through which he could kind of control the country. But it was certainly true that since the death of Tito, the political setup and the political bureaucracy in Yugoslavia was very unwieldy. I've mentioned that when Tito died, the presidency devolved to the various republics, and they shared it on a rotating basis. 1 year one year Croatia would have it, 1 year Bosnia would have it, 1 year Slovenia would have it, and it would rotate in this way. Now, this was a very sort of cumbersome way of governing, very ineffective, and it meant that in the grip of this kind of political and economic crisis, which Yugoslavia was in the 1980s, the various sort of political parts and the political apparatuses of the Yugoslav state found it very difficult to cope and very difficult to move quickly and effectively against these problems. So very often Milosevic would simply claim that what he was doing in the second part of the 1980s was attempting to sort of reform and modernize and sort of rebuild the Yugoslav, the very sort of creaky and old-fashioned Yugoslav bureaucracy. This was around about the same time, in fact, exactly the same time as reforms were being attempted in the Soviet Union, of course, perestroika, Mikhail Gorbachev, all of this kind of thing. And so for many foreign observers, what Milosevic was doing looked very similar to what they believed Gorbachev was trying to do in the Soviet Union. Take a very old-fashioned political system, very old-fashioned economic system, and bring it into a much more modern and a much more effective way of working. Now, in practical terms, what this involved was Milosevic ousting people from the various republics and replacing them with his own people. Beginning in Serbia, he took over the party apparatus, betrayed his mentor Ivan Stambolic, but then moved on to places like Kosovo, Vojvodina, the northern autonomous province, and Montenegro. So that by 1989, Milosevic controlled almost half of the various parts of Yugoslavia. Now it's quite a complicated system, so I won't go into too much detail. And if you do want more detail, you can watch the documentary, or you can read about it in Silber and Little's book, The Death of Yugoslavia. But essentially, the way the Yugoslav system worked was on key decisions having to do with the constitution and having to do with the political direction of the country. Each of the republics had a vote. And the two autonomous provinces of Kosovo and Vojvodina also had a vote, and there were 8 votes then in total, the 6 republics and the 2 autonomous provinces. What it meant when Milosevic took control of Serbia, Kosovo, Vojvodina, and Montenegro was that in fact he or his allies now controlled 4 of the 8 votes within the Yugoslav setup. If you move to slide number 6, you can just sort of see a map of the political structure of Yugoslavia, which will perhaps help you sort of remind you of the way the state was set up and the way the state looked. This was quite a serious matter, in fact. By 1989, Milosevic had transformed the political style of the country away from this kind of grey communist bureaucratic stuff and into this kind of nationalist demagogy, holding large rallies, using quite emotive language. So he had grassroots support amongst many Serbs, of course not all of them, but many, not just in Serbia, but living in Kosovo and living in Bosnia and living in Croatia, believed that Milosevic was their champion, the person who would protect their interests, which of course Milosevic claimed were being trampled and were being ill-used within Yugoslavia. But at the very top level as well, at the highest levels of the political setup of Yugoslavia, Milosevic now by 1989 also controlled the most important parts of Yugoslavia's political structure. He had 4 votes on the rotating presidency, which means it was simply impossible to vote him down or vote him and his allies down. Now, the 2 areas that were most concerned, in fact, throughout the country, many people were deeply concerned with the direction that the country was taking, believed that these changes Milosevic was affecting and implementing were very negative ones. But the most acute problems, the most acute worries were felt in the most Western republics. If you look at the map, if you look at the map on slide number 6, I'm talking about Slovenia and Croatia. And I will talk about those in more detail in the next session. But for the time being, what I would say is that if Kosovo was the poorest part of Yugoslavia, Slovenia and Croatia were the richest parts. Particularly Croatia, which was getting a lot of money from tourism. Ever since the 1960s, the Dalmatian coast had been opened up to foreign tourists, and a lot of foreign money, a lot of hard currency, a lot of Western money was coming into Croatia. So those 2 republics, proportionately much richer than most of the rest of the country, and also the party leadership, the Republican leadership in those two republics, becoming increasingly alarmed at the direction that Milosevic seems to want to take the country. Not only that he's deploying this kind of nationalistic rhetoric, that he's using terms and historical references and symbols which are quite unlike the ones that have been used in Tito's time, but also that he's beginning to rally this kind of mass movement of Serbs, potentially against their interests. So the country is really starting to sort of show its seams now. It's becoming potentially a very sort of serious and very divisive crisis. And in our next session, I want to talk a little bit more about the Slovene and the Croat responses to what Milosevic was doing. Okay, thank you.